So, Adriana, the first person who introduced me to you and your work was a mutual friend of ours, David Feidler. And I'm so grateful that he did that. And it took me ages to follow up on the recommendation. But when I did, uh, I said, let's get this interview going. Of course, we're going to have common ground between us. Uh, and then when I started listening to your book, what really stood out to me is the commonalities between our experience as musicians. And I thought that it would be really good today, perhaps, to just begin by giving you an opportunity to tell your story for fresh eyes for our podcast listeners. For I guess the way that you were educated in music and what you took away from that and your experience. And then I'd really love an opportunity to tell you a bit about my story as well. And I think that that will set the foundation for what will be a beautiful conversation to come. So I'll hand it over to you, maybe just to tell us who you are and your upbringing with music.
Well, of course, I'm very interested in hearing your story, Simon, because I've talked about mine quite a bit in recent months since the launch of my book in October and continue to be quite busy with book appearances. But certainly I'll fill people in and say, I'm finding my experience is not uncommon, as you suggest with yours. I was 5 years old, and my mom brought me to a very formal music conservatory. We didn't have a lot of money in our family, and these lessons were free. So she thought, great, I'll get my children enrolled in classical music for free, and this will be good for their brains and their development in general. She had very good intentions. She took my older sister and I to a strict conservatory in Quebec. And I was 5 years old. I didn't realize when I was placed on top of an upside down waste paper basket, because I was so small, there weren't any chairs at this conservatory my size, in front of a panel of adults who were kind of looking at me sternly and taking notes. A cello was thrust in my arms and I was asked to play. I didn't realize this was an audition. And what I also didn't realize when I was accepted into this conservatory, I didn't realize there was sort of a Faustian bargain at play, in the sense that there was an expectation that I dedicate myself to the life of a classical musician from day one, in exchange for free private lessons, theory, solfa, which is the solfege, the ear training and sight singing technique, orchestra, quite many hours a week of instruction starting at that age, and that continued for years. And so there was a sense of being a dutiful child and going along with what was expected of me. I also did love much of the music, but as the years went on, I had increasing misgivings, soul searching. What was all of this for? My body started to rebel. I became increasingly perfectionist and unhappy about playing. I found myself very sensitive to comments that instructors would make. And really, I had my entire identity vested in this pursuit. I didn't do anything else. I didn't do sports. I didn't hang out with friends after school. It was really, I got up at 6:30 in the morning, practiced as much as I could before school, did homework at lunch, rushed home, did a few more hours of practice. And this was happening by as early as age 12, 13. I was logging in 2-3 hours a day, and then it went up from there. And I did my first university degree in cello performance as well, until eventually I just had, I would say, a physical and emotional breakdown after 17 years. So maybe that's a quick capsule of that experience. But then other things happened that changed how I felt about it all.
Well, I mean, the way that you lay it out in your book is so beautiful. It reminds me of a quote that we've heard from who is now the honorary professor in the Walled Garden, Professor Joseph Siracusa. He said that one of his philosophy professors said to him that philosophy is like throwing a brick through a window to let some fresh air in. And I feel as though your book does that with such beauty and grace, telling your story of how you were educated in a very strict manner that nonetheless was well-meaning. Nobody ever wanted you to not have a great experience with music, but we've found ourselves in this very constricted view of what music is and what it's supposed to be in Western culture at the moment. And I think that in your book, you do such a great job of throwing a brick through that window and say, look at all of the possibilities for what music could be and how it can be such a beauty in our lives. And I did want to share a bit of my story with you because I think it's beautiful, the commonalities. I mean, my degree is in jazz, trumpet, and singing performance, and so when I was growing up, uh, I had two instruments that were my initial first loves, you might say. It was piano and it was the didgeridoo, as you'll probably know, the sacred instrument of the Australian First Nations people. And I was obsessed with like Aboriginal culture in Australia. You know, for a long time there, when I was very young, you know, I loved like the instruments, the artwork, all this sort of stuff. That kind of faded away as I grew up, and the piano faded away because I played mostly by ear, and I would just listen to things and have such a great time on the keyboard. But then when I started getting lessons, it was with a classical teacher, and so it was all about, well, you must play these notes at this time and play in time and do this and do that. And I hated it. I didn't want to do it, and so I gave up the piano. And uh, I ended up learning trumpet and doing singing as I was getting older, and I got this degree. And it wasn't until many years after my degree that I had learned some chords on piano, things like that. But there came a time where I really started to question, hang on, I see myself as a jazz trumpeter and as a jazz singer, and I perform these pieces. Reminds me of the Bukowski poem where he says the pianist played songs that he didn't write, sung lyrics that he didn't write to audience that didn't care. It's like that kind of that the thing that you outline in your book as well, that question of, well, if I'm just playing the music that everybody else has created, what does that mean? And so I started to strip away these layers, and so maybe I'm not just a jazz trumpeter or even putting the category of a genre. Maybe I'm not even a trumpeter or a singer. Maybe I'm just a musician. And what does that mean in terms of the broadening of my possibilities? And I started playing the piano again, but not in a style where you go to it and say, I'm going to learn all these scales and these chords. I'm going to go through the books and all this sort of stuff. I just sat down at the piano and said, okay, the most important thing is I love this instrument, and I know that I can spend hours and hours a day playing this and not get tired and not want to stop. So I need to do this. And I need to treat this as if this is something within my nature as a human being, that something is pulling me towards this instrument. And I did that with the piano. And after about 6 months, I had already recorded my first album with all original compositions on piano,
Wow.
with singing and trumpet and nature sounds and all this sort of stuff. And then I created more albums. And it's not technically brilliant, but I know that it is the most authentic expression of my soul. And that's what was so powerful about these experiences. And I did the same thing with the didgeridoo. I finally bought myself a real timber didgeridoo, spent some time with a guy who I think his family made it, spent 3 hours talking about it. He was so excited that I was picking up this instrument and taking it to America, the sound of Australia. And the progress that I've made on these two instruments, just for the fact that I said, screw the dogma. I love these instruments. I want to play them, and I'm going to play them how I play them. It's been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. And so when I started reading your book, I was like, wow, finally somebody is saying this thing that I've been experiencing and holding in all this time. So I wanted to tell you that because I feel that our experiences are very similar. And I guess I'll throw it over to you, maybe just for those who haven't read your book yet, what are some of the ways that you feel as though the music education system as it is, perhaps mostly in Western culture, because that's where we have our grounding, what are the things that you think that go right, and what do you think goes wrong?
Well, first say I find your story very moving. It's and one of the things that I hope people do with my book is recognize themselves in the book. And I think that that's what I'm hearing from people. I'm hearing that that's happening. People recognize themselves in passages that talk about the pain of being told they cannot sing or have no voice, or the pain of having difficult musical baggage that they haven't had a chance to look at in their lives. And that might sound, I mean, music is equally important to everyone. So it might sound dramatic to some people to hear that. And yet I'm finding it's a pain point for many people. They feel deprived of a birthright as a musical person, and our species is deeply, intensely musical. And so that's another thing I really want people to know, that even if your main interaction with music is listening to it and deriving pleasure from it, the cognitive processes in doing just that are exquisite and important and meaningful. You're musical if you love music, right from the get-go. So I'd like to reclaim what it means to be musical and redefine it as well. It doesn't mean that you've done 20 years of practice and stood on a stage to sing, or sat at a piano and wowed people with your impeccable performance. That is not the definition of musical, and it shouldn't be. So that's one thought. To answer your question more directly around music instruction, that was the question, right?
Mm.
I can talk about that culturally, and I can talk about that neurologically. And I think that I'll start with the neurological. One thing I talk about a lot in the book is how many of the benefits of music, including the health benefits, they stem from music's ability to stimulate the pleasure and reward circuitry in the brain. And there are a whole bunch of pleasure chemicals involved in how that is stimulated. It's not that important to know them all, but it's a very important aspect of music's effect on us. However, we also have various other circuits in the brain, and one is called the periventricular system, which is sometimes called the punishment circuitry. And that is the circuitry that prepares us for fight, flight, or flee or freeze, those responses to threat. And we know from neuroscientists that when the punishment or periventricular system is activated, it short circuits the pleasure reward circuitry. So if you think about it, you're in a lesson being chastised by a teacher, and you really want to please your parents or the teacher. That circuitry of fight, flight, freeze, fight. I always get mixed up with the F's, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
That threat circuitry is activated, and it's shutting down the pleasure reward circuitry that we need to feel good, enjoying music, playing music, and feeling musical. And we're being deprived of some of the strongest effects that music has on our brains and body. Even the pain relief associated with music, it stems from that pleasure reward circuitry. There's a downstream effect on the spinal cord and all of I could get into endogenous opioid receptors, et cetera, but we know they're connected. So right from the get-go, teaching children with these methods is going to put them at risk of being turned off music for life, or make them hate the lessons, or make them, like me, dutifully go through it, but be missing something in the process. And many readers have identified this poignant quote that I include in my book. In the book, I'm a journalist first and foremost now as an adult. In the book, as you said, there are quite a few personal passages, but I applied the same rigor to those passages as I did to any of the science sections. I excavated boxes of my possessions for old diaries and photos and playbills from concerts, etc. And so I found a diary entry from when I was 12, and it's written rather formally saying, I want to have pleasure. I want to be a good cellist, but most of all, I want to have pleasure playing music. It was something like that. I don't have the verbatim on the top of my head, but essentially, as a 12-year-old, I was recognizing there's something wrong with this picture.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing, right? Even at that young age, how we can sense that something's not quite right with the way that we're being educated. I was thinking about this as I was listening to your book, because for me, I never wanted to get into music education, you know, and And perhaps there was a part of that that was actually to do with the fact that I had this idea in my head about what education really is and how it should be done. Fast forward a few years, obviously now I'm managing a music school, and I'm thinking about it in a completely new light. And what's so beautiful is that we do have a team here who's very interested in removing ourselves from that old way of doing things and saying we're in a new world, a new time, a new place. People are interested in using music for different purposes. How can we tailor our education to that? And I think that what you do so well in your book is just outlining all of the many ways that music can be used that we don't really think about. Obviously, so much of the education that we get today in music is from a classical foundation. I mean, there's a lot of jazz universities, but even the dichotomy that I found at the conservatorium of, well, we've got the classical department and we've got the jazz department. Firstly, people like Miles Davis might have vomited at the fact that there was a jazz department. It's basically doing exactly what we did to classical
Yeah,
music by codifying it and saying, well, this is exactly how
formalizing it.
jazz should be, and then
Mm-hmm.
we're going to teach it. And even Alan Watts, he says what we do is we find these great geniuses who come along and change it from time to time, and then we say this is how it's done, and then we codify that, and it's just this complete cycle. Uh, Maybe just speak to all of the different ways that we can look at music in terms of its use in our culture. Not only the ways that we just naturally use it, but maybe the ways that we've kind of lost sight of how it can be used or how it can be taught, maybe in our culture today.
Well, one of the difficulties with classical music is that we send children to lessons and conservatories to learn music that is not listened to at home in many families. Parents will bring out the video camera and be very proud of their child getting through Für Elise at a recital, the Beethoven piece, but they're not at home listening to Beethoven, and the child isn't hanging out with friends listening to Beethoven, and the music class might be the only time they hear that music. And so it's odd if you think about it. I use a sports analogy in a sports analogy in the book, saying it's as though we're sending children to archery practice or falconry while the rest of the family is going to the hockey game. So there's a disconnect there. Music in other places in the world is embedded in everything people do, while cooking, while working, while feasting, while celebrating, and it is in mainstream Canadian, Australian, North American, English culture too, but not quite as much. And the way music is taught is separated from the communal ways we use music. So it's quite odd if you think about it. I spent all these years learning sonatas from the 18th and 17th and 19th centuries. But if you put me at a campfire, there was not a single song I knew to play that people would want to sing along to. I didn't have music, any music knowledge that was relevant to the culture, the surrounding culture. So this is not what happens everywhere. I've had the fortune, and I mentioned a few travel experiences in the book. It was actually hard to choose among them because I've had the fortune to travel quite a bit. But in some places, in Cuba, in parts of Africa, and in Brazil, places I've been, people learn music at the family, around in the family kitchen, at the campfire, on the beach, at the communal gatherings, and many people would tell me they're playing this complex instrument, and I'd say, well, how did you learn? And they'll claim, well, one day when I was 12, I finally got a chance to hold one of these instruments, and I was instantly able to play everything. But in fact, the instruction would have happened by watching the uncle closely, or hearing it every single day, and practicing the clapping that goes along with it, and the vocalizing that goes along with it, and having all those sounds in the ear since before birth. So the music education occurred in an entirely different way. So by the time the 12-year-old was actually allowed to touch one of those instruments, they did already know a lot of things. Their brains had registered the finger movements and from others, and sure, they probably still needed to get the motor coordination down a bit, but there was a lot of education just absorbed from the community.
Yeah. Hi friends, we'll be right back with this episode, but for now, I wanted to tell you about one of the services that we are proud to offer in the Walled Garden Philosophical Society, and that is philosophical mentoring. This is a method of coaching that aims to bring the mentee's actions into alignment with their most noble aspirations. And as mentors, we do this by holding space for philosophical dialogue and mutual discernment of the paths that lead to a flourishing life. At the Walled Garden, we have a whole team of truly world-class philosophers who are here and ready to walk with you as you face life's many challenges and opportunities. And we just love to meet you and see how we can help. If you'd like to book an initial consultation, just go to thewalledgarden.com/mentoring. Again, that's thewalledgarden.com/mentoring. We look forward to working with you, but for now, enjoy the rest of this episode. It's so beautiful to think about how we can move back in that direction. But then even immediately while I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking, my my negative mind is coming in and saying, remember all of the noise restrictions that they have back in Australia, and just thinking about, even just I remember having a mentoring session with a client of mine who was in Portugal, I believe, and him talking about heading out into his street where he lived and just hearing all, they'd get together every Friday night and have food and music and all this sort of stuff. And, perhaps we've lost a little bit of that, in our Western culture, but even when we talk about the education and classical and jazz and different ways of being educated, I wonder if there's a balance to be struck here, because on the one hand, in terms of technicality and proficiency at the instrument, we can't deny that the classical education system has been a phenomenal advancement in our ability as human beings to make incredible music. And so many of the great musicians had a classical background. But nonetheless, they still need, I think I put it to one of my students like this: if you need a sheet of music in order to make music, then you're a slave to the page. You're enslaved by that page right there. If you can't just pick up the instrument and start playing and having fun, there's something deeply wrong here. And so, what do you think the balance is for learning music out there? And perhaps also just a side question there is, do you think that there has to be a kind of room for discernment of the specific goals of the kid? And when is it appropriate to discern whether or not they are going to be going down, say, a virtuosic path or just for fun? Sorry, I've nested a whole bunch of questions in there.
It's okay. And I will preface my answers by acknowledging that I'm not a pedagogue, or my book isn't mainly about music education. I do talk about it, but it's not the main focus of the book, and I'm certainly no expert in music instruction. I'm not an instructor myself. I think you're right for parents and children to have conversations about expectations, because that will also direct the choices in instruction. There are a lot of different systems out there for teaching music. And so I think part of what happens is that parents do want the best for their children, and they don't always put as much thought into the end result or the end goal or what they would like their child to experience from music. And also perhaps don't always have the time or even the idea that there are lots of options in terms of how you learn. So that would be one thing. And does it have to be classical music? Could you start with marimba or another tradition that maybe is closer to what the family engages with as musical family or likes to listen to? I mean, there's no reason children can't start with folk songs or and there are all kinds of riffs you could add to a folk song if your concern is to develop technique. But that's another question: is technique important? You're right that the brain science certainly shows that the rigorous classical training before the ages of a window between 7 and 9, those are the types of musical activities that will create the brain of a musician that is recognizable on brain scans years later. Whether those brain changes are significant in other areas of life is still very much under debate. As you said, there was a lot nested and a lot to unpack. I think whatever tradition a family chooses, make sure the lessons are pleasurable, because the evidence does also show that stimulating the threat response impedes learning. So you're not only removing pleasure, you're also interfering with the ability to learn. I think also we could be more creative about the exercises that children do. There's a lot we could borrow from sports medicine and sports psychology. There's a lot of visualization now that happens in sports to avoid wear and tear on the soft tissues, and that could be better implemented there have been the odd book written about it for musicians, but not a lot of focus. And I think I'm somewhat against practicing by rote, because if the child's by themselves, looking in the mirror perhaps, or not, or just gazing off into space, they might run the risk of reinforcing the cramped position and the bad habits rather than practicing effectively, so they might have logged, I think I certainly did that. They might have logged the 2 or 3 hours that were required of them, but were they improving? Were they practicing in a position that was sustainable for their bodies? Were they actually learning the passage, or learning to play the passage poorly and really reinforcing that? So I think there could be a lot more attention on how do you practice? What are effective practice methods that make it A, enjoyable, and B, actually helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, it's one of the things that I said to my trumpet student the other day. One of them, I said, learning trumpet is fine, but the most important thing is you need to learn how to learn, right? And I think that even just teaching kids how, if you just picked up this instrument and nobody was around and it was your job to figure out how to play it, where would you start? How would you be mindful of how your body reacts to the instrument? Where would you put your fingers? And I know a lot of that is difficult, but I find that it can be a little bit too kind of too mechanical these days. With, okay, you're going to play this scale and this and it, but are you being mindful so that I don't have to actually always look over at you and say, well, you're doing that wrong, you're doing that wrong. You can actually discern. And I wonder as well, just in terms of bringing music back into our culture in various situations. You mentioned other cultures where kids are kind of watching their parents play these instruments, and then they're kind of picking up these clues along the way. I wonder, do you think that do you think that we've kind of lost a sense of musicality as we have, say, well, let me put it like this. I was speaking to James here at the school, and he was telling me that the number of piano makers that there used to be in America, right? And how many pianos they were churning out every single week. It was incredible. And how that has just died down to the point where, a few thousand pianos are sold in America each year, like upright grand pianos. So obviously people are having less instruments in their home. We've gone technological, so we're always listening in the ear. And I guess that's what I'm trying to get at is, do you feel as though we've become more musical as a culture because we can all listen to whatever we want to at any time? And, obviously there's so much availability in terms of the music we can listen to and where we can hear it. Or do you think that we kind of need to return to that kind of the family gathering around the piano and just jamming it out, playing music by themselves? Do you see the kind of direction I'm going here?
I do, and I'm hesitant to make any broad statements about what people should be doing. And I'm also hesitant to favor instruments like the piano or the violin, which are, traditional Western European instruments, over all the other instruments available in the world. It would be sad if pianos died out entirely, but but it's also important to meet people where they're at. And if that's not where people are at, you can become quite a traditionalist and dogmatic if your entire effort is revolving around preserving something like that,
Yeah.
if that makes any sense. Um, at the same time, there are lots of new ways of being musical, as you point out. A lot of kids are spending lots of time working with MIDI systems and creating effects and playing with DJ apparatus and that kind of thing. And the hip hop culture as well. There's a lot of electronica involved, and I'm not part of that world. And I think it sounds like from what I've seen, it's a very creative pursuit. A concern I would have is less around do we preserve the piano, but more around embodiment. Music is a deeply embodied activity for humans, and I say even in the first introductory, I think it's a couple of pages into the introduction, I point out that if you're in an MRI machine and you are perfectly still, even if you're just listening to music perfectly still, the putamen, which is part of the motor center of your brain, is activating. Your body wants to move, and it feels as if it's moving, even if you're not, because that's what music makes us want to do. And so to lose that with too much electronica and too much technology, I feel would be unfortunate. I would like to see people feeling free to dance to music, feeling free to participate. The other issue with lots of electronic pursuits is that there's a barrier to entry for others to join in if they don't have the same gear. And I mean, there's always been a barrier for entry with various types of traditions and instruments, but preserving the embodied aspect of music would concern me more than preserving any particular instrument.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's the spirit of the question that I was trying to ask there. I would not suggest that it's about a specific instrument, but I was more interested in, how do we return to that kind of not even return, it's getting to that place where, I guess I am reminiscent of these times of, you gather around with the family and somebody jumps on the piano and everybody's singing along, things like that.
Yeah.
I wonder if moving in a technological direction removes us from perhaps what you're saying here, that kind of embodied experience, and also a kind of community experience, a family experience of bringing us closer together. And of course, we have things
Yeah.
like karaoke, all this sort of stuff where people are really getting into it. But yeah, I'll let you. Yeah.
I have that concern as well because in many families, people aren't even listening to music at the same time anymore because of the headphones.
Yeah.
Not long ago, you'd have a giant family stereo, and people might fight over what music was played, but when it was played, everyone could hear it in the house. And now you can shut people out entirely and go in very different directions musically, which is nice in a way, but you don't have that shared bopping to music together. And I show in the book that our brain waves synchronize to music. This is well demonstrated. Our brain waves adjust to match the pulse in the music, and when we listen to music together, we're literally on the same brain wavelength because we're all synchronizing to music, and they do show in studies. So there these neat labs where they can hook up all of the audience members to caps with electrodes and see what's happening in the brain while the musicians are on stage performing. And they've demonstrated the more that brain synchrony is happening to the music and each other, the more pleasure and sense of social connection people are getting from the experience. And that's why
Wow.
even today we have excellent recordings, but everyone still wants to go to the stadium and see Elton John or the Stones or whoever's touring, because it's such a powerful experience. And we could
Mm.
have more of that in daily life for sure.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, you're reminding me now of one element of your book, which I'm quite fascinated in. And Judith, if you want to jump in at any point as well, I'd love you to, because I would love to discuss the kind of the Greek or the Greco-Roman kind of philosophical attachment to perhaps how we see music today, but with Plato and Pythagoras, and um, I'm very interested in this idea of reinvigorating a kind of Dionysian approach to music. I would love to see, and of course this happens from time to time, but a whole bunch of people drinking wine and just getting together a whole bunch of instruments and saying, let's just make music, you know. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Well,
maybe just talk to us about the kind of that kind of Greco-Roman early history of how we kind of developed the. Talk to me about those elements of your book, because I'm very fascinated with that.
before I do, I'll just say
Yeah,
to your point about going for it after imbibing. I
yeah,
mean, at one point, I had to sort of champion the title of the book because the publisher had other ideas that were more tied to marketing. Um, I like the title I have, but when I was brainstorming titles, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to call it Playing Badly? And it's a terrible title in terms of marketing, but I liked the idea of people understanding that playing badly could have its merits and it could be joyful and fun, just like people will tell bad jokes. You can play bad music and still have fun with it and still be part of the experience. And to give people permission to feel that that's a good starting point and it's a valid starting point, because honestly, even people picking up instruments for the first time as an adult, and I'm hearing from people the other day, a reader emailed and said that they started the cello at 70.
that's
Which is an
awesome.
impressive thing.
Yeah,
But then
yeah.
the next thing they have to say is how badly they play. And I think that's unfortunate because it shows such courage and accomplishment to take that on at 70. Do you have to slam yourself in the next thought? And that's what we do around music. We're so critical of ourselves and each other. And I don't see that in other places. It's recognized in places like Brazil that, oh, that's the really good singer in the family. But other people are singing off key and no one's staring at them, asking them to shut their mouths. So
Mm, mm.
this is one thought. And I wasn't
Can I
alive.
just? Oh, sorry.
Sure.
Before we go into Greek, and I have to respond to that because I think it's very necessary what you said. Uh, I remember early on when I came here to the music school. I was doing some substitute work, and I was working with this kid, and I said, "Let's do a little ear training exercise." Okay, so I'm going to sing a note, and I just wanted to see if you can find that note on the piano, right? So it's fine, even if you just mess around, like go find until you find it. Right, we'll see what happens. And I noticed when I sang a note, a couple of the kids they would sit there and oh, they wanted to get it right the first time. and I could see sometimes their hands were shaking. I was like, what's going on? These kids, they're afraid
Mhm.
to make a mistake. And it's funny what you say about playing badly. When I first jumped on the piano again and said, I'm actually going to do this, I'm going to sit down and see how I learn and see what I come up with. uh, what naturally developed was kind of a learning style of structure and play, where
Mm.
I would sit at the piano and say, this doesn't have to sound good. It doesn't even have to sound nice. I'm just going to start hitting the keys and it's going to be chaotic, kind of a very yin yang kind of chaos order situation. And my policy was always, let's just have fun until an idea comes up. And when an
Mm.
idea comes up for something beautiful, like a meditative piece or some melody, that's when I'll say, okay, cool. Now I'm working on something. It's still going to sound pretty rough, but I'm working something else. I'm saying, what happens when I allow my soul to take control of my hands and just say, what are you trying to figure out here? And in doing that, I found it so liberating because my music now, and people hear that if they listen to my recorded music, uh, it can be very chaotic at times, but it always resolves and comes back into some sort of order or some sort of structure. Um, and I found that that was so incredibly helpful, not only for my creativity, but for allowing me the freedom to say, I don't have to be right the first time. It doesn't have to be perfect, but there's something being figured out here. And that's what's most important. So I just think, yeah, I think that's so important what you're talking about there. And if we now take that back to the kind of Western roots of music as we see it today, talk to me a bit more about the kind of Dionysian element, the plays and wine and merrymaking and how music kind of looked back then.
Well, I'll say I think your students are very lucky to have you, because your conception of how to approach an instrument sounds really wholesome and um, thoughtful and sensitive to the human condition. And so more of that, please. That's one thought. My impression is just as we have many different forms of music now, so did we in ancient Greece. So I did far more research than I ended up including in the book. I mean, I must have read, I can't think of how many essays and for a paragraph in the book. But even in ancient Greece, there was a dichotomy between the music played in the fields and in the farther regions of the empire, and the music that was valued by the Athens elite. So that's one thing. There was a dichotomy, and they were even divided by the instruments. So the aulos was the peasant, the instrument, the two reeded pipes, that was the peasant instrument, and the lyre, which is the U-shaped harp, that was the music of Apollo and of the gods, and that was favored by. There were various texts saying that aulos was a debased instrument because, of course, it was a peasant instrument, and the lyre was rarefied. So we still had various dichotomies and divides at that time. The word music, it comes from a Greek word musike, which was a blend of theater and poetry and dance and music, and it was considered the way to channel the wisdom of the muses, the goddesses of these things, into daily life. So it was a portal for this divine wisdom to come through into a political rally, into a wedding, into a funeral, into a feast, whatever occasion you were having, or even just cooking. That was a way to bring in the divine knowledge. So that's pretty interesting. I couldn't believe that I'd spent all those years studying music and I didn't know that it was connected to the word muses, and now it seems very obvious. So that's one thing. You have different tiers of music, formal music, and informal music, informal music. And then the other is that in the writings, now Pythagoras didn't leave writings. Everything we know is from his followers, but supposedly Pythagoras had uppers and downers, specific tunes that he would prescribe to his followers. This is what you play to perk you up in the morning, and this is what you play to chill down at night. And for various illnesses, this is what his followers say he did, because the different scales in Greek knowledge were considered to have different properties and specific effects on our moods. And this one will prepare you for battle. This one you don't play because Plato was particularly judgy around which scales one should play, because that one could induce drunkenness, etc. So there were prohibitions around music back then too. We shouldn't say that now is the time where everything's restricted. There was quite a bit of talk and debate among the philosophers about the healthfulness of different forms of music. However, music was regarded as a very powerful thing. I mean, all of those debates stem from the idea that music could change your temperament, your physical health, etc., which is quite interesting. Around Dionysius, the idea is that there was a lot of emphasis on rhythm and dance, and, like you say, wild frivolity that's stirring the blood. I mean, you know more about philosophy than I do, for sure. And the idea was to induce a state of ecstasis, which is the Greek word for ecstasy, which means being outside of oneself. You wanted to have a transcendent experience through the wine, through the dancing, through the music, because that was a way to become whole. It was a way to be reborn and become whole, to exit yourself and then come back. There was a return to the self with a more broadened awareness and that sort of thing. And music was considered a way to get there. Music and dance and rhythmic music and wine, etc. Now, the Catholic Church, the early church fathers came onto the scene, and the writings suggest they were aware that music was embedded in all parts of Roman life. So the Romans adapted a lot of the ideas, and this is documented in the writings. There's a book you might really love called Music as Medicine, and it goes back to a lot of these texts from antiquity and traces how the thinking and the understanding of music changed over time. And that was a great source for my book. The early church fathers saw that a good way to discourage people from drunken riots and all of this wild activity, sexual activity, was to put strong prohibitions on music. So their writings of the early church fathers, Clement of Alexandria and others, said musical instruments are more suited for beasts, and listed all the different ones that were not okay. You could like bugles, trumpets, etc. There was a whole list of music that instruments you should not play, and that talked about the diabolical choruses of party music. And there was one text I wanted to include in the book, but it was too long, and it was a church father talking about the movement of the loins in response to rhythm, and I was just thinking, oh, he got a really close look. Anyway, so there's a lot about that, and the decision was to warn churchgoers against music other than the human voice. You could have a lyre at home if you were singing scripture, a lyre at home, but not in church. There were no instruments in church for centuries. And at the beginning, only men sang in church. So women weren't even allowed to sing in church. It was stripped of rhythm, stripped of harmony, stripped of wild leaps in pitch. So we got Gregorian chant, which was the official music of the Catholic Church for 1,000 years. And you might say, well, that's just in the church. But the church, when you go to the villages in Europe, you'll see there's a church on every corner. So it was, the church was watching what you did. You could maybe play and dance at a wedding or, a party or that kind of thing. But the priests were observing what members of the community did. And many people find Gregorian chant absolutely exquisite. And that's fine. It is transcendent music. But it's interesting to see what messages it sends about the type of wild music making that you're talking about in Dionysian times.
It's quite incredible just to think about the fact that music was so important that people did try to constrict it. They could recognize that it has such an effect on the people, the culture. Of course it does. And it's to me, I look at the times that we're in today, and I don't necessarily think that we are completely restricted. What I do think is that the education system hasn't quite caught up with all of the possibilities that we have today.
Yeah.
Even like you mentioned with MIDI instruments, that's what I did. I started on a keyboard at home and started making all of these pieces, and bam, you get this new software and you're sounding like you're on a $50,000 grand piano. Now, of course, many would argue that you need to record it in person if you want the real sound, and fair enough. But the point being that there is so much possibility today. I'll tell you, we had a kid come in here recently who had learning difficulties, but nonetheless, for a couple of years had been learning piano by YouTube. And he comes in here and he starts playing on the piano, and this kid's an absolute genius. He's been learning for 2 years, and he's playing some of the most difficult pieces, classical pieces ever known. And
he's doing it for pleasure, because
he's doing it for pleasure. Exactly.
Gripped by something. Something has gripped him that gives. I've met children like that too.
Yeah. And to that point, I want to focus on that, because my intuition tells me that when a kid wants to learn an instrument, it should be exactly like the scene in Harry Potter where he goes in to pick out his wand.
Yeah.
And he picks up this one, and nope, that's not the one. And then this one, it creates a bunch of, but this one, there's a moment of, this is the one that I want to learn, and this is the instrument for me. For people who are listening out there who maybe they want to pick an instrument, or their kids want to learn an instrument, uh, uh, I'll preface this by saying the horror story that I always see is a parent has their idea of what instrument they want their kid to play, and the kid just doesn't want to play it. And so the parents just, oh, you've got to do this. No, this is the thing that you're doing. But the kids just, they're not motivated, right? But how would you say that people should pick out an instrument if they're looking to get started? Hi, friends. We'll be right back with this episode. But first, I wanted to let you know that most of the conversations that you hear on this show were recorded live at events and workshops in the Walled Garden Philosophical Society. We are so grateful for the quality of our guests and the kind of conversations that we get to have at these events, and we'd like to invite you to attend and join the conversation. Our events feature contributing philosophers of the Walled Garden, as well as world-class philosophers, theologians, artists, and spiritual leaders from all around the globe. If you'd like to come along, then just go to thewalledgarden.com/events. From there, you can find an event that you're interested in and register with a donation of your choosing. Or, if you're a subscribed caretaker in the Walled Garden, then you can get into all of these events for free by simply logging into the website and joining the Zoom waiting room via the event page. Again, go to thewalledgarden.com/events to register today. We look forward to seeing you there, but for now, enjoy the rest of this episode.
I think there are sometimes events I've heard of called instrument petting zoos, where
Great idea. I'll steal that.
yeah, an instrument petting zoo where you could take children at the age of 3 or 4 and stick them in a room with 20 different instruments, and adults could play them for a bit and then put them down and allow the 3 and 4-year-olds to touch them. The things you're talking about earlier, touch them, plink them, stroke a string, see where the child goes and then maybe if the child is open to it, the teacher or adult could say, would you like to play a note? And the child could say no or yes, no, just an invitation to interact with these instruments to start with. And a lot of people love the prelude that I have at the beginning of my book, where I talk about the experience of holding a cello for the first time and making my very first notes. And you see in that passage an incredible sense of wonder. And it was absolutely genuine, this sound and these vibrations going through my tissues, my bones. It was a remarkable feeling that I will never forget. It's sad that so many people might have that the first time they play an instrument, and then it's diverted. It's overshadowed by all the other stuff. They don't get to spend enough time in that moment of wonder. So what if lessons began with a lot more of those moments,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe the lesson begins with a teacher playing something they find joyful and allowing the kid to like color while the teacher's playing and just have that music washing over them. So, maybe that's the beginning of instruction. I think reinvent what music instruction looks like. So the petting zoo is one idea. Another idea would be to take small children to lots of different music contexts. I mean, I grew up in Ottawa, and that's the national capital of Canada. And so there were always festivals with music and dance from around the world. My stepfather at the time worked in the Department of Multiculturalism. So we were brought to these events quite a bit. And I've often wondered if that's where some of my ability to reclaim music in my life came from. So after I left cello, there was a long period where I didn't engage in musical activities other than maybe dance at a concert. But since then, I've dabbled in many different instruments and traditions and had an interest in that, perhaps from watching people from around the world playing these things and hearing these sounds when I was pretty small. It was sort of there embedded, and later on I had a reference point for some of those sounds. Maybe I'm just actually realizing this now, making that connection, the ability to be exposed to different instruments without a pressure to choose right from the get-go, or you're taking it in, that's one thought.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that idea of the petting zoo. I love this idea of just getting the kid in the room and saying, hey, I'm going to play some stuff for a while. Why don't you just go over there and draw or sit, or just come up and be curious, whatever it is, see what the spirit moves you.
Yeah.
um, uh, I think one of the barriers to that is, and I'm just thinking out loud here because, very selfishly, I know a lot of my questions are directed towards music education because we're thinking about that at the moment, and we really do want to see a kind of a new renaissance in the way that we think about educating kids. And one of the ways is I would like to teach kids how to think deeply about music. As opposed to it just being a very mechanical thing. But I've spoken with James, who's the other manager here, and he has a beautiful way of inserting history into the lessons. And, well, did
Huh.
you know this great flautist, that they did this, or this composer, and this piece that you're playing right now, here's the history of this piece. I think that's a beautiful way of doing it. But one of the blockers, I think, is, we get into a lesson and there's perhaps this trap of feeling as though the lesson needs to be productive. And so they need to be able to play this page by the end of the lesson. They need to be able to do this by the end of the lesson, and this. But I really resonate with that idea of let's just get it. Let's just spend a bit of time winding down, playing, having fun, enjoying the instrument. So yeah, I think, was there anything else that you wanted to add to that, or I'm taking a lot of I'm trying to put these ideas into my head for a later day, but
Well, I think there could be a balance too. And one thing you were talking about how your colleague inserts snippets of history, and I was thinking, in the book, I talk about this piece I played when I was 10 or 11, and it was called a tarantella, and it was a piece I quite enjoyed playing. But how cool would it have been to know that that was the music used in southern Italy for several hundred years to supposedly cure a spider bite? I
wow,
was
yeah,
never
yeah,
informed. It was the go-to remedy. It probably didn't work in the way that the peasant community intended it to, but it would have been it would have changed how I felt about practicing that piece had I known. So that I think that's a great idea of your colleagues. Another thing could be to uh, do a mix of the more formal teaching and the more spontaneous and loose. Um, there's a passage in the book where I describe these spontaneous music workshops my mother did with early. They were early workshops in the early 70s with children with Down syndrome and severe disabilities, and it was very radical at the time to put kids in a room with all these musical instruments and dangling car parts and huge gongs and have them. They were actual musicians playing, adults playing, but the children were invited to jam along however they wanted, or not, or just sit in the corner and rock themselves, whatever they wanted to do was permitted and encouraged. And I mean, you're never going to learn how to play a formal piece that way. So I wouldn't suggest that that should be all that one does with children in music instruction, but to have some of those moments to, again, like you said, broaden the possibilities. I bet that would be rewarding for teachers too, to have that experience with their students. And I think it creates a kind of intimacy and maybe even could strengthen the relationship and the bond between a student and their teachers. Maybe the teachers are also jamming in that setting, or the parents as well. Maybe it's the parents, teachers, and the child. The parents might
yeah,
get a kick out of doing that. So you could have happenings like that occasionally in between some of the more formal instruction. And certainly kids could have, if the idea is to, get through certain levels, the children could have more impact or more choice in the repertoire that is chosen, what more say over which. There are many pieces that are at similar levels. Is there a reason they have to do this piece? Could they not do one that speaks to them more? That those are things that are, I think that's happening more than it used to,
mm,
but that could also be considered. And as I said earlier, a lot more could be done around effective ways of practicing and learning, even if you're going to do a formal approach,
yeah,
and leveraging the knowledge from sports psychology.
yeah, absolutely. Amen to everything you're saying. This is all just really valuable stuff. And uh, maybe just one or two more questions for you. Perhaps speaking to the people out there who maybe they've been considering picking up an instrument, like you write about in your book, where you were thinking about getting the ukulele. Uh, but they've got these barriers in their mind, whether it's, don't have enough time, or I'm too old, or, I don't have the skill, whatever it is. What would you encourage for those people? What kind of words of encouragement, or what did you learn through your research? Is the best way to get through those kinds of blocks?
First of all, there's safety in numbers. So there is safety in numbers. And I can tell the story of a friend who, in her early 50s, so safety in numbers, to pick a genre that you are drawn to, pick an instrument and a genre that you are drawn to. So she signed up at the community center a few blocks away from me. There is a weekly bluegrass jam, all levels welcome. And she had never played the stand-up bass in her life. She played some drums, but really didn't have any experience playing a melodic instrument. She started going to these sessions on Tuesday nights, not knowing how to read music, not knowing how to play stand-up bass, didn't even own one. She had to kind of talk to the instructor about using one that was there. And she chose a genre that was not the most complicated. It's not the most complicated genre, bluegrass, and just went every week and did what she could and gradually picked out notes, gradually learned to play some songs. Well, 5 years later, she is a stand-up bass player in a band.
Wow.
It's
Yeah.
and they create their own music, and they do some recording and some performances. They're not highly professional group, but she is performing in front of people on a bass that she didn't play 6-7 years ago, and she started in her 50s because she was motivated by pleasure. She didn't have strong end goals, and she took her time getting to know it. And she was in a group, so any mistakes she made were camouflaged by other players who were also playing badly. Some were playing well, others were. The multiple level thing is actually quite nice, because the strong players do help out the younger, or sorry, less experienced, not always younger players, and it
Mm.
can still sound pretty good if enough players know the parts. So that would be an example, and you can find something similar in most musical and versions of that. Perhaps not in classical, but certainly in choir. They have choirs that where anyone can show up. Some are even called tone deaf choirs, where they acknowledge people believe they can't sing in tune. Sometimes they can't, but a good instructor can offer tips on how to deal with that, and how to get over that, either the negative self concept or actual problems with vocal control. Because very few people are truly tone deaf. It's something like 2.5%. Which means you can't hear the difference between the tones, the pitches. If you can hear the difference when someone else is singing out of tune, then you can probably learn to sing yourself, because you have enough. It's considered a neurological condition to not be able to distinguish those pitches. If you can hear someone else singing out of tune, you are not tone deaf. You just
Mm.
need help learning to use your voice.
Yeah. No, those are some beautiful suggestions. I think that you're spot on. You're making me think of my auntie in Sydney who, retired age, went and joined the School of Rock, and just started
Awesome.
singing. And it's just like, she's my hero. What a cool thing to do at retirement, just to go and start singing with a bunch of people and see what happens. And I wonder, after this uh, grand adventure that you've gone on, trying to figure out what happened with your music education, and then, how that relates to the culture at large, and where are you at the moment? What are you doing with your music? How does music interact with your life after this big adventure?
I I absolutely need to do music in some form, and I prefer to do it with others. Practicing by myself isn't my favorite thing to do, but I still do it because I need to play instruments, and I need to sing. I've joined a choir. I talk about one choir in the book, I've been very busy with my book tour, so I wasn't able to stick with the choir I had before. I've joined a different one that only practices once or twice a month, but it's absolutely beautiful music with stunning soloists. And I do not have a trained voice. I did the sight singing when I was a kid, and that's it. But now I'm super inspired by the sounds of the soloists in the choir. So I've already signed up for a music camp with the choral director for the summer. And part of me is thinking, oh, maybe in a couple of years, I could be one of those soloists, because they're doing soul music that uses that rich style that's very juicy. So that's one thing. I am still plugging away at the ukulele, playing badly.
Beautiful.
Yeah, playing badly. And I will say, I think if you reached a high level at an instrument, it is a little trickier to accept playing badly, but I'm determined to just keep going with it. And it doesn't sound very good yet, but that's okay. I feel privileged because it's a lot easier for me to pick up another instrument than it might be for someone with no previous background. So I'm teaching myself ukulele. I do play the mbira, which is the instrument that I talk about in the book, from Zimbabwe, with the many keys, played with the thumbs, about the size of an iPad. And in fact, this object here is called a deze, and it's the gourd that surrounds the mbira as an amplifier, and the
Wow.
bottle caps are ringing around it buzz with the sounds of the sympathetic vibrations, and it's quite a trippy instrument to play. So I play that occasionally. I'm not taking lessons. I do adore my drum teacher, but she's shifted most of her lessons online, and I'm not as drawn to playing via YouTube. I really do like the in-person. So I'm holding out till those in-person drum classes happen again. But I'm enjoying choir, ukulele, and the mbira in the meantime.
That's beautiful. I love it. You're even making me think, all these different instruments. I'd love to see a resurgence of people even just experimenting with making their own instruments. I
Mhm.
love seeing when people come in here asking for different parts. I'm putting this together, I'm putting that together. It's such a beautiful pastime. But yeah, amazing. Adriana, this has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate your wisdom on this topic. It's incredibly helpful, not only for the direction that we want to go here, but even just in the walled garden, what we're looking to do is to integrate the various areas of the humanities and say, well, how does philosophy interact with music? What can music teach us about good philosophy, poetry, all these different areas, and just saying, we want to think deeply about all of them and bring them together in service of our, quest for truth and wisdom and virtue and beauty. And so your book is excellent. I really hope people
Oh,
go out there and grab it. And
thank you.
on top of that, just it's a pleasure to meet you.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you so much. I have a little added note, if you don't mind.
Please, yes.
Uh, so recently, well, last week, I was approached by the president of a foundation who wanted to buy 300 books, copies of my book, to give away to guests at a big fundraiser in March. And so I contacted my publisher, and they said, we don't have any copies left in our warehouse. So the book came out 3 months ago, and the stock is already declined quite a bit. There's some availability in warehouses in the States and in Australia and UK, but not a lot.
Mhm.
And I know how many are on Amazon, and it's, again, not a lot. And there won't be more copies available till June, when the paperback comes out. So if you really like hardcover, now is a good time to nab some of those copies that are still circulating, because my publisher doesn't have any more, and they're not going to republish the hardcover. So some people have strong feelings about hardcover versus softcover. Softcover is coming in June, but there might be a gap in between. And of course there is the audiobook. But I wanted to put that out there because I thought that was news to me. I didn't
Of
expect
course.
it at this stage in the game. So it's exciting, but also people who really are keen to get the hardcover might want to jump on that. And I'll also just say that my website is adrianabarton.com, Adriana Barton.com. www.walled-garden.com. And I do reply to people who message me through the website.
Beautiful. Well, congratulations on selling out of stock. That's awesome. And there's no wonder, because it's an excellent work. It's a necessary work for our times. And this has been beautiful. And I'll be in touch over the next few days.
Great questions, and it was my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Walled Garden podcast. This show is the central podcast of the Walled Garden Philosophical Society. To find out more about our events, services, and community, just go to thewalledgarden.com. Until next time, we wish you well as you nourish the gardens of your mind.